All right, the Lord be with you. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, has caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning. Grant we may in such wise hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that by patience and comfort of thy holy word we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which thou hast given us in our Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. Good evening to all. Was it 29 that had that? 29. Yeah, there it is. Okay. So we're starting a study in Daniel, which is a book that has some things that are going to that do relate to Revelation, which is we just stopped studying. But it's a different setting and a time horizon. So I have put up on the board some dates I want to walk through, because to me it always helps me to know if I'm reading a biblical book, where am I? You have to kind of know where what's happening, what's this all about, to know what's being addressed in it. So I think here is a sort of highlight of some important dates in Old Testament history that they get us to Daniel, who is writing somewhere around 600 and later BC. And so in the Old Testament, a kind of important figure is Abraham, who's sort of the first datable historical figure. Before Abraham, we argue about when these things happen, but a good rule of thumb for Abraham is that he lived as far before Christ as we live after him, because these circa dates usually mean plus or minus 100 years or so. We don't know for sure. So we're, 2019, and he was about 2,000 years before Christ. And we had Isaac, Jacob, Israel, and then they went into Egypt into captivity. And then we had the Exodus under Moses, which is traditionally dated 1440 BC, although some modern datings will argue for about 1250 BC or something like that. We are not going to get into that. But if you want to get into that, there's an interesting book called Pharaohs and Kings, which will help to argue for this date. Because there's a quote I loved that made the point that all biblical dates are dependent upon a few shards of Egyptian pottery. They do archaeology, they find these things, they date them, and then they say all these other things fit in here. So if you're off with a king name or a layer of thing, that could change everything. So these are traditional dates. People argue about these dates, but this is what we're sticking with today. In the Exodus, they came out of Egypt. They had the covenant at Mount Sinai, where God entered this covenant relationship with Israel under Moses, the law, the Torah. After Moses, you had Joshua, went into the Promised Land. And then in the Promised Land, there was the period of the Judges. There's a book called The Judges that chronicles that period, about 1400 to somewhere around 1030. And then you had kings of Israel. And they're divided kind of into maybe two sections. The United Monarchy, which was Saul and David and Solomon. Saul was about 1030. Solomon's death about 930, 931. And so you had three kings of united Israel. An important thing to remember in Old Testament history is that this is your golden age. David was a warrior who beat all Israel's enemies. Solomon was his son, who was a great administrator. And there's this he built the temple, and there's this huge dedication of the temple under King Solomon. And during Solomon's reign, all of the nations surrounding Israel were tributaries to Israel. That is, they paid taxes to Israel. Israel is the major Near Eastern power. And you will hear echoes in the books talking about Solomon that all the promises God gave to Moses, here they came to pass. God was good to his word. Living in the land, the temple, prosperity, descendants. And then it just goes downhill from there. Some of the roots of that were in Solomon himself, who began to marry foreign princesses in political alliances and introduced idolatry into Israel, into the temple itself, because if you married a foreign princess, you had to allow her to bring her gods with her into Israel. And one of the things that later that Jeremiah God expresses his anger is the introduction of child sacrifice into Israel, a shrine to Molech. Anyway, but that's the golden age. After Solomon's death, there is a division of the kingdom because Solomon's son doesn't have the political power or savvy he had, and there's a divided Israel from then on. The northern kingdom, called Israel, the capital at Samaria, and the king was Jeroboam. The southern kingdom, the capital of named Judah, the capital of Jerusalem. The first king was Rehoboam. These guys have in common that their names also represent sizes of champagne bottles. You get a Jeroboam and a Rehoboam of champagne. And then the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and Kings chronicle this gradual decline under successions of kings in the north and the south. The northern kingdom goes away first. There's a day of the Lord, a judgment to Israel and Samaria in 722 BC at the hands of the Assyrians. And they had a policy when they conquered their enemies, they brought some of their own people and resettled them in the land, and they took some of the native people elsewhere. Excuse me. And this is the origin of the biblical Samaritans, the mixed race in the north that has a kind of bastardized practice that had some allegiance to the Torah, but also other practices mixed in. And then about 150 or so years later, the southern kingdom of Judah with its capital Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, and the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians was 586 BC. The destruction of the temple takes place, and the Jews are carried away into exile in Babylon. In fact, the Babylonians were threatening Jerusalem for a number of years before they actually built a siege around Jerusalem and completely leveled it. And so people were carried off into exile in Babylon in stages. And I think Daniel and his friends who were among the exiles may have been in one of the earlier stages. Because when they would conquer a subject people, and they would take some of the best young men and train them for posts in their kingdoms. That's where you see Daniel. They're officers in the Babylonian Empire because they trained some of the choice people for that purpose. So the setting for Daniel is that this is Israel in exile. The temple in Jerusalem has been destroyed by the Babylonians. Israel is in exile. The hope of the Old Testament promised in the Torah, realized in this David-Solomon period, has now been lost. In the Torah, God promised Israel land and descendants and prosperity, and now there's no land, there's no prosperity, and how are we going to get back to that place. So that's where we are when we get into Daniel. And the issue with Daniel is how do they live faithfully in exile. This is a significant thing, I think, for us in our time horizon, because we're living in a, increasingly as Christians, we're living in a kind of exile as we've moved from what people would have called Christendom, that is, a Western world in which the Christian understanding of things and worldview was essentially embraced as the majority view, to a situation now where to be a Christian is a minority view, and indeed it's a belief, a way of life that finds pressure on it to not do that you'll find opposition if you're faithful to it. And Daniel finds that too. So there's some correspondences then, I think, with what we see in Daniel about living in exile in Babylon, and how we will have to adjust probably over the next season of time what it means to live in a foreign country, a country which no longer worships the one true God. One thing I wanted to say to jump in, and I'm going to let Hayden then get into the text a little bit, as by way of background. The prophet Jeremiah was the preeminent prophet, not the only prophet, but Jeremiah's ministry was maybe from 620-ish BC up until the time of the fall of Jerusalem in 586. And we read Jeremiah during Lent, I believe, at evening prayer. And he's the one who actually warned of the coming judgment and actually counseled the elders of Israel not to resist the Babylonians, that they should willingly acquiesce to Babylonian rule because God had ordained this as a result of their unfaithfulness. Nationalist sentiments prevailed instead, and they, after having submitted to Babylonian rule, which meant the Babylonian king would march out with his armies, beating the bounds of his empire, and sort of subject nations, and essentially say, either give us so much money every year, or we're going to level you. And so what the smart nation would say, okay, here's some money, but then they'd go back to Babylon because they'd be done with their military exposition. And then when they were back in Babylon, then like local countries would start saying, well, I don't, and then then Israel would make a deal with Egypt. Will you protect us if they come? And we'll charge you, half the money or something. And so make a deal with Egypt, which sounds good until the next time the king comes and the Egyptians lose the fight and you get destroyed. So that's kind of what happened. And it's interesting that the two major powers at that time were from the east, Babylon at that time, which had conquered the Assyrians, and Egypt, and Israel exists in between. They're not really, if you went as the crow flies, there was a big desert there. You always went up the Fertile Crescent and came down. So Israel was between Egypt from the south and the way invading armies from the north came, and they were always torn between who you made an alliance with. And one of the big complaints of the prophets against Israel is precisely that they made those alliances at all. Is that you don't trust in the Lord God, you rely on Egypt, you rely on this person to save you, you make deals, you don't just trust God. So that's what happened to Israel. And so what I want to read is, by way of introduction, is the prophet Jeremiah, when people have been carried off into exile in Babylon, he wrote a letter to the captives in Babylon, giving them instructions. And here's what it says, Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 4. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all who are carried away captive, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and dwell in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters. And take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may bear sons and daughters, that you may be increased there and not diminished. And seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord for it, for in its peace you will have peace. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are in your midst deceive you, nor listen to your dreams which you cause to be dreamed. For they prophesy falsely to you in my name. I have not sent them, says the Lord. For thus says the Lord, after 70 years are completed at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you and cause you to return to this place. And then he says one of the great verses of the Bible, for I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and go and pray to me, and I will listen to you. And you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. And I will be found by you, says the Lord, and bring you back from your captivity, and will gather you from all the nations and from all the places where I have driven you, says the Lord, and I will bring you to the place from which I have caused you to be carried away captive. And that, I know the thoughts that I think towards you, that's our introit for the last few Sundays after Trinity every year. Wonderful chant. I know the thoughts I think towards you, thoughts of peace, not of affliction. So this is what God says to those, that this judgment that's come by the Babylonians was God ordained, and you've been carried away captive. So live there, pray for the city, seek the peace of it, and God promises he'll bring them back from captivity. And one last thing about this that kind of goes beyond Daniel, but just to put this in a little larger perspective, this whole exile motif informs the history of Israel going to the New Testament, because though Israel does come back from exile at the end of 70 years, well, the temple is rebuilt in 515 BC, and Israel comes back and has a life of a national life in the promised land. Israel never gets back to anything resembling this, the Golden Age. There's never a return to the blessing that Israel experienced under David and Solomon, the king and the king's son. So the question of the New Testament is, though we've come back from exile, there still is a sense in which God is not here with us. And so the question of the New Testament is, how do we get back to this place of blessing? But this is the beginning of this exile motif and so the book of Daniel deals with that. Any questions about any of those dates or any of those things? Okay. Everything I said was perfectly clear. Yes?
You said that they never get back to the same prosperity as in the Golden Age. So then, even though God had promised that they'd be living in a land flowing with milk and honey, it's not the same?
Yeah, I mean, well, a couple things characterize Israel from this captivity on, with the exception of a brief period under the Maccabees. They are always under the dominion of a foreign ruler. They're never nationally free again, ever. And that's a New Testament issue we find. So we can't that alone precludes the promises of the Torah being fulfilled. What the New Testament, in fact, teaches us is that Jesus, the Son of God, becomes man to fulfill the Torah on Israel's behalf. Israel has been unfaithful, and Israel as a nation has been unable to fulfill the righteous requirements of the Torah so as to achieve the promised blessings. So Jesus does on Israel's behalf what Israel is unable to do. And through his faithful life, his death, which fulfills the Torah, the blessings of the covenant are now brought upon the new covenant people, which is reconfigured around the apostles and the church. So, and as I've said, I want to get into Daniel. This is a little bit, but so the last prophets of the Old Testament, when the temple was rebuilt in 515 BC, there's some prophetic activity around that. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi prophesies in this period. Somewhere from around the 400s, maybe mid-4th century, prophecy dies in Israel. There's no one from 450 or the 400s BC until John the Baptist in Israel who can say, "Thus saith the Lord." And so that this exile is punctuated by that drought. All right.
Is Daniel aware of what Jeremiah was saying?
Yeah, yes, I think so.
He was probably aware how Joseph acquitted himself in captivity.
Well, we have some things to say about that, about some parallels between Daniel and Joseph. So,
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think that we're meant to read Daniel that way. Daniel is written in a really interesting, as a book, is a really interesting book, and the way it's written is, it's told in a couple of different languages. It starts out in Hebrew, and then it switches to Aramaic, which is the language of that region. At the time, especially, it would have been like the language of the court of Babylon, where they were all staying, and then switches back to Hebrew again around chapter 7, and so it's told in two different languages, but also in parts of it there are direct quotations pulled from the Joseph story and sort of and put on the character of Daniel in this book. And there's a clear connection that's intended here between these two stories. You're meant to see Daniel in the court of Babylon very similarly to how we look at Joseph in the court of Pharaoh, and let that story illuminate this story too. So as we read through, especially the first 6 chapters, first 6.5 chapters, we'll be kind of looking back to the Joseph story as a story that illuminates what we're reading here with Daniel, because that's how this book is written to be read. Yeah, it's assuming you have a prior knowledge of Joseph and the story of God's faithfulness to him in his time in Egypt, and how through that faithfulness, like the whole people were delivered. Similarly, you're going to get this idea with Daniel, that Daniel and the faithfulness of the few in captivity is this means through which God redeems the whole of Israel and brings about the end of the captivity. So you see this all over the Old Testament, that the faithfulness of a few sort of leaven the whole and bring about blessing for the whole. And so you'll see this with Daniel and like other figures that are like him, like Esther is another figure that stands out for this. But yeah, you look at like Joseph, Esther, Daniel. These characters are meant to be seen as similar types in the Old Testament, and so it would be good to read Daniel as a Joseph figure. Yeah, I think we should. I think there's more to say on that, but I think it'll be helpful to get in the text first before that becomes clear. Yeah, but yeah, we should just jump right in.
okay. All right, so let's read. I'm going to read verses 1 through 7. of Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried in the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God, which is the house of which is Babylon, land of Shinar, same thing. Modern Iraq, essentially. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the minister of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's nobles and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, and to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So this gives a summary of how, the besieging, and what it was that Jerusalem was holding out. There was a war against the Babylonians, so the Babylonians dug a siege mound around the city and starved it out. And so it was brutal. The Lamentation of Jeremiah was a prophet. We read Lamentations a couple of times during the year, but Lamentations is a lament over the city that Jeremiah is kind of walking through, seeing what's happening in the starving out of the city, cannibalism, very horrible things happening. So siege war was not a great thing. There's also the incident that happened in the destruction of Jerusalem that some people found an escape through the siege and escaped, but the Edomites cut them off and let the Babylonians capture them. And so Psalm 137 has some very difficult words where it says, by the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept, we remembered thee, O Zion. But then it says, the psalmist says, remember the children of Edom, how they said, and they were sort of cheerleaders, happy that the Babylonians were destroying it and cutting off the captives. And the psalmist says to the Edomites, blessed is he who takes their children and throws them against the stones. Which in modern prayer book versions, those verses are omitted from the public readings. But you get the pathos of people who are being completely destroyed and losing everything they have. And Edom is supposedly the brother who helps, yes. So, and we see that the instruction of the Babylonian king was to look for gifted men to serve in his court. And he found Daniel and his friends. Anything else about those opening verses there?
No, I think it's important. I think for chapter one is like this sort of establishment of our characters in the story, right? So there's an elaborate sort of scheme here to set them up and to establish their greatness. This is a book about that's highlighting. It's kind of like a hero story. It's building up this idea of Daniel. This first chapter is like a sort of identity building part of the story. And so the critical thing will be to say, what does give them their sort of unique identity among the captives of their... We know what the Babylonians identified them for. It was their sort of appearance, their sort of aptitude. But it's going to contrast with what actually sets them apart as the sort of the hero protagonists of this story that's about to unfold. So this is the setup for what will become the main sort of contrasting set of characters that follows in the next like for the first 6 chapters of Daniel. So chapters 2 through 5, 2 through 6. So 2 through 6 will be the unfolding of the exploits of this cast of characters. But this is their sort of like what the Babylonians note them for, but then what they will actually be noteworthy for as this text goes on. So watch them. We get to see what actually gives them their unique sacred like identity in the course of the story here.
So we're told also in verse 5, the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which they drank. And then in verse 8, as we go on, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, the assumption here is that these are sort of not according to the dietary instructions of the Torah. So this is there were things you couldn't eat, certain kinds of meats and things like that. So he wants. So we're immediately brought into the knowledge that Daniel's a faithful Jew,
right?
Which is interesting in the sense that Israel is in exile for its unfaithfulness, but here we have a faithful one.
There's also the insinuation here that these are perhaps, like especially with the wine, the way it's apparently I had a note here that the way it's inflected in the text suggests that it's like that this feast is also set up as it has some share in like the local cult to the god of the place too. So it's possible that all this these are it's that idea of meat sacrificed, part of sacrificial offerings that are now adorning the banquet table, and these wine offerings are part of a libation offering too. So it's both that these might be unclean things, but it's also made unclean by the fact that it might have there's a plausible connection to the Babylonian gods, and this being part of the sacrificial system for that too, which would also be participating in the idolatry of that, which Israel is also characterized by.
Understanding that virtually all ancient religions had animal sacrifice, and that the idea of offering something to the god and then partaking of the feast was a common religious motif, which we still, when we give thanks to God for our food and eat it, it's sort of the same general thrust. Verse 9, now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portions of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So, a little test. So he consented with them in this matter and tested him 10 days. Wasn't there something in Revelation that we trialed 10 days? Was that?
Yeah, that's
that's
chapter 2.
Chapter 2 of Revelation.
I got it here.
You'll be tested 10 days, be faithful.
Yeah. 2:10. Yeah.
Echoes, not suggesting the direct, but echoes. And at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portions of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. There is, I think, if we were drawing this parallel with the Joseph story, Joseph was also in exile. He had been taken captive, having been sold. And in Egypt, when he was sold to the king's jailer, he also had a test. Do you remember what that was? Well, he could interpret dreams like Daniel will, but he also, somebody liked him.
Oh, Potiphar.
Potiphar, yeah.
His wife.
And the wife of the jailer, and wanted...
Potiphar was the captain. Right?
Yeah.
He was the captain, and he was like a court official.
Yeah.
Like Ashpenaz, right?
Okay, right. So she wanted, and so wanted Joseph to sleep with her, which on some levels would have made life easier for Joseph, but he refused to do it, refused to do that which was not right. And remember what happened to him because of it?
He was put
in jail. So because she accused him of rape and then or of attempting it, and so he got in trouble for it. I just think the parallel here, they're different motifs of testing, but they're common in that. So Daniel is faced with, you can eat this sort of pagan food, and just make nice and get by, but he says, no, I'm not going to do that. And Joseph had a similar test of his loyalty to God and his behavior that he also refused to capitulate in. Verse 17, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, we're seeing the seeds here of something that's interesting, which is what we might call a missionary aspect of the exile. So if Israel had never been disobedient and just stayed in their land, few of them would have gone to, they weren't like modern missionaries who would have gone on a mission trip to Babylon. But Daniel, being forcibly removed from his home country to Babylon, now is in Babylon as a witness for the one true God. And he is there in the midst now, in his faithfulness. He is now in the king's court and his friends as the most choice and wisest and gifted of all people, who is faithful to God. So there'll be now an opportunity for God to manifest his presence in the midst of this hostile environment. And I should say that this is something that is a fairly common theme, biblically, also historically. In the history of the church, when Rome was overrun by the pagan tribes, the net result was that the mission was to convert them, which they eventually did. So one application we have to be under, sometimes we can view the negative circumstance of exile only as something to escape from, but we must not lose sight of the vocation of God's people to bear witness in that exile. to those who do not know him. And so our presence in those situations is also opportunity. And God is being known now in Babylon through his witnesses. Anything else about that?
I think in order to kind of keep setting it up as if this is our sort of intro to these characters who are going to figure so centrally into the next few chapters, you have a contrast set up here between the reason that they were brought in and then what really sets them apart. You have this idea that their faithfulness is actually the thing that gives them, that creates the strength, and that sets apart this idea that there's a sort of these two contrasting value systems that are present, that run parallel to each other in this part of the story. You have what is sort of what their surroundings are dictating to them, and then what they are the thing that this covenant faithfulness that they are representing as fully as possible within that value system. And there's a contrast constantly of a dialogue happening between these two things of their representation and witness to the God of Israel in the midst of this world in which everything is sort of antithetical to that. And you'll see this contrast running through the next few, but it's set up here that the strength and the unique heroism of these four figures who are about to play this really critical role, they are set apart because of their covenant faithfulness, and that is what makes them heroic in this sense. They are being strictly faithful to the covenant in the midst of a world that is presenting them with the opportunity to compromise, and because of that, that is what triggers their heroic ascent, and then gives them the platform on which these stories that unfold in the next 5 chapters will sort of stand. But this is like the setup for that, and all those chapters and the stories we're about to read are going to harken back to this critical contrast we see in this first chapter. John.
I wonder if also there's something that their steadfastness and refusal to compromise are completely opposite of what we would think about today, where they won't even eat their food, but they'll still serve the king. Where we would think, do whatever you can to survive, but don't help them politically or something like that.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah. There's clearly here is a commentary on not compromising with one's faith in the midst of this, and the idea that because as Jeremiah said, I've ordained you to be or seek the peace of the city, the idea that maintaining, as it were, the sort of rule of law that this is the king, and God's going to speak directly to this pagan king, which is interesting, and there's something about that. So how do we play that out? It does seem that it's not. It's the idea of having a vocation in a hostile environment where you're doing work to help. If the work itself is not immoral, I'm assuming they're doing administrative work and helping govern the palace and the empire in a very ordinary way is not necessarily being functionaries in say the temple. It's a good meditation. I don't know that there's a direct one-to-one, but there's sort of a thematic idea there and there's a question: what does faithfulness look like, and how do we bear witness to faithfulness and non-compromise? What does that look like? Is it with a kind of militant contrariness, or I don't know. It's a good question.
But it's interesting what these things sort of symbolically stand out as, right? Like it goes back to that Jeremiah 29 exhortation to seek the welfare of the city in which you go. This is the sort of, that is covenant faithfulness, right? Because that is spoken through the word of the prophet to the exiles going into captivity. But I don't know, like it has resonance with the Sunday lessons we've been having, especially like the idea of like submit to the the instituted authorities and and in all goodness, right? And but there's a difference. So for some reason, and I think that it's plausible if you read the feast as connected to the worship of the local deities. If you would read that as part of the sort of broader religious world, you can see that as like that's participating in idolatry in a way that assisting the function of the government isn't. But that is, I think, an inversion, because I don't know, there seems to be a tendency to think a lot more like top down politically, right? That the significant change will come when there is a sort of toppling of a political scheme versus versus the integrity of personal faithfulness.
Yes, a lot of people would be more politically active in a contrary way and religiously unfaithful whereas Daniel is bearing witness to a religious faithfulness and a kind of willingness to work for the good of the state.
Plus the text sort of clues us in at the end of chapter 1 here too, where it's like, and when this phrase, and thus Daniel remained in Babylon until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. There's a sort of that's both a descriptive phrase, but it's not. I don't think it's merely. I don't read it as merely descriptive, because you have this idea of like, in the meantime there'll be a toppling of an empire through a military coup. Mm-hmm. You'll have kings come and go, but Daniel remains.
That's very interesting. King Cyrus, for our information, is the Persian king who leads the conquest of Babylon and issues the famous decree of Cyrus for the Jews to go back and rebuild. That takes place in 539. So Jews return to Israel in 539, but the temple is not rebuilt until 515. So Hayden makes an excellent point there. Daniel continues, he's faithful, he's going to continue. There's going to be a couple more kings before Cyrus, all of whom will fall.
Yeah. And even Babylon falls.
And falls. Yes.
Well, is it faithfulness, obedience, description?
Here, yes, it is. It's also portrayed here, though, that as a faithfulness of worship and service to God, particularly in terms of worship, I think, not compromising that. I would hearken back here also to, and Daniel's going to pray, we see as a praying man, praying for the salvation of Israel. When we read Revelation, we talked a lot about the power of prayer. And I think the power of prayer combined with faithfulness is also evident in Daniel. So nothing Daniel does in his service to the government is in violation of any of the Ten Commandments. And we later are told of Daniel's faithfulness in his prayer. He prays 3 times a day, which is the first appearance in Scripture of the concept of the daily office, the hours of prayer at fixed times. Now this is fun. In chapter 2, we get into the dream. We get to know what Nebuchadnezzar thinks of the astrologers, sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. So now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. So they stood before the king, and the king said to them, I've had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. The Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give you the interpretation. Then the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut to pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. You just get the sense as he's had a lot of times he told these guys dream, they give a bunch of cock and bull explanations, and he wasn't having it. So for them, you're going to tell me the dream, and he's had enough.
Well, this chapter begins in a real panic.
Yeah.
The phrase there, his spirit was troubled, and sleep left him. It doesn't really betray the desperation of the moment. It's a panic. Right, it's a panic that causes you to have your sleep leave you. The term is his sleep wandered away from him because of his panic. It fled away from him. But also that phrase, his spirit was troubled here, is lifted directly out of Genesis 41, which describes the Pharaoh of the Egyptian court when he had his dreams and he wakes up in a panic. The phrase used in Genesis 41 is inserted here to describe Nebuchadnezzar in his dreams too. So this is again connecting Daniel's action here back to Joseph in the court of Pharaoh.
And in both cases, there's a lesson that God is sovereign, and He's in charge of the Egyptians and the Babylonians as well as His own people.
Kind of interesting that people still worry about what their dreams mean.
Yeah. There's
Is there a message we're supposed to follow, or is it just random thoughts purging our minds while we sleep?
What do you think?
I have a lot more now than I used to. I wonder about it sometimes, just because I relax more than I used to be.
One thought is there's probably a combination of things.
Yeah.
I've had a dream where I felt like God said something to me, but I don't think every dream I've had. Sometimes you're just having a stupid dream, or you wake up and what was that? Or you have the dream where something's happening that you, oh no, I'm not doing this, and you wake up, oh, I didn't do that. Now I go back to sleep.
And the medievals had a whole taxonomy of different kinds of dreams. They had a whole catalog of ones that were divine of origin, ones that weren't, ones that were lying to you, ones that were telling you somewhat of the truth, some that were just indigestion. You ate spicy food that night. They had a whole encyclopedia of it. But this has an odd resonance with sort of what we would understand as a Freudian psychology, right? With the idea that your dreams are symbolic manifestations of what's going on in your unconscious, and you have all this stuff broiling in there that you can't possibly understand, but occasionally it erupts out like magma in weird forms that need to be decoded. But Daniel even sort of doubles down on that later on in here in verse 30, when he says that I'll make known the interpretation to the king that you may know the thoughts of your mind. Which suggests there is a connection between those things. It's a psychology that's sort of set out there.
Yeah. It's God speaking. I actually think, not to get into dreamology or anything, but and sometimes there are buried parts of ourselves that may show up because we're not in touch with it in conscious space. Sometimes that can be trauma related too. It just cracks me up. You just get the vision of all these people. The king's not having any of it. However, if you tell me the dream and its interpretation, verse 6, You shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore tell me the dream and its interpretation. They answered again and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there's only one decree for you. If you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time is changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. And then we get, I think, a very pivotal verse. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. We already know, and we've already been told.
Right, the meaning is with the gods.
Where was this? Verse 17 of chapter 1, that God gave them skill and knowledge and all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding all visions and dreams. So, we're all ready to object. No, Chaldeans, there's a guy. Verse 11, it's a difficult thing that the king requests. There's no other who can tell it to the king, except the gods whose dwelling is not with men, with flesh. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious and gave command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. You just get the feeling they really haven't been doing a very good job lately in giving a great deal of wisdom.
Over their heads.
Yes.
Well, we know he goes mad eventually, so he can never get over it.
That's true.
So the king went out and they began killing the wise men. They sought Daniel's companions to kill them. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, Why is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time, that he might tell the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. They might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, and you have made known to us the king's command. Interesting so the response of Daniel is, give us time and let us pray. And they verse 18, seek mercies from the God of heaven. And then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel didn't develop an activist plot. He prayed and was given the wisdom to avert disaster. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, I found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, his name was Belteshazzar, Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered in the presence of the king, The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. Now, notice that Daniel uses his opportunity to let him know where it came from. They can't do it, but there's a God who reveals things. He's revealed this to me. He doesn't just say, yeah, I can tell you. He uses an opportunity to bear witness, as it were, to the God of Israel. Verse 29, as for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this, and he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me because I have more wisdom than any living, but for our sakes, who make known the interpretation of the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. You, O king, were watching. Behold, the great image whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. The image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, and notice that, the king, the God of heaven, has given you a kingdom. God is still sovereign even over the pagan ruler. And wherever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand, has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all others. Whereas you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. And as you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So what is this all about? What are the kingdoms?
Well, in Sunday school, they told us, the Medes and the Persians and the Greece and Rome.
Yeah, okay. So the chronology or the succession that Cyrus the Persian they'll conquer the Babylonians, and then Alexander the Great will conquer the Persians, and his kingdom will be divided up, and then the Romans will become preeminent. And then, what is this? Stone not made with hands.
That's God's kingdom.
Huh?
God's kingdom.
God's kingdom. Which comes about during the midst of the fourth kingdom, which is Rome. So we're going to have a lot of prophecy in Daniel that spans a great deal of time. But when we realize the gap we're entering into, this sort of return from exile that's not really that doesn't really end the exile, and this waiting, the fact that Daniel gives the ultimate horizon of the answer to that is significant. The, of course, image of Christ is a stone, a rock. The cornerstone, the image comes up. And Jesus has a prophecy, on whoever it falls, it'll be grinded to pieces.
Mm-hmm. There's also that image in Revelation, too, that with the fall of Babylon is linked to the image of a great stone being thrown by the angel into the sea. And then that heralds the fall of the city. So it's picked up again in the later imagery. I don't know, you get the political dimension of it here, though, in chapter 2, whereas you didn't get it as much in chapter 1, that this is all having to do with the passage of the kingdom. Right, so this comes back to the point, but it sort of sets it in proper order, right? You start off, the establishment of these characters is an act of covenant faithfulness, but chapter 2 comes sweeping in and like sort of expands the picture and situates that initial scene within this much larger context, right? You have the God who, in the hymn of Daniel, to whom belong wisdom and might, who changes times and seasons and removes kings and sets up kings. Like it's a return to that cosmic vision in which this sequence of empires is situated. So that it's a sudden reminder that, like, you know, we start off this chapter like sort of enmeshed in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar, and then like this tight inner circle, and then there's an expansion throughout the chapter as it goes along, such that you now by the end of it have this great king paying homage to this Jewish captive at the end, whereas in the beginning you had the king issuing this like dread decree over his Chaldeans to wipe out all the wise men. Now you have this like you know, peon wise men, newbie, you know, is now like being like supplicated to by the King of Kings that God had set up, right? And so you have this radical reversal in the course of one chapter here, which all pivots around this fulcrum, which is that hymn in the middle of it, which is about how God changes the seasons and brings kings up and lowers them down. And so you see that in dramatic form, even in just like the relations within this chapter. Nebuchadnezzar starts out on top issuing dread decrees, and at the end ends up supplicating to a Jewish exile.
Who rises up because of his covenant faithfulness.
Right.
The other image that came to mind in this, which is not a direct parallel, but Samuel, who is taken to the corrupt temple at Shiloh when he's a young boy, because his mother had prayed for him, and she gave him to God, and he slowly rises up as Eli and his corrupt sons are killed in battle and becomes the sort of last sort of judge prophet that introduces the kingdoms. But the image here so Daniel, who is faithful, is the one to whom God reveals his will. So not only is Daniel revealing to King Nebuchadnezzar the will, but Daniel now also understands in a new way the sovereignty of God, and a sort of it reminds Daniel, he's sovereign over history, and he's got there's a plan here. There's something is unfolding in a determined way. And I just think we can't lose sight of the fact, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the determining factor of Daniel is his faithfulness, is what makes him the vehicle of to whom God reveals things and through whom God reveals things. And he is the savior of Babylon, because he's just saved all of the wise men, and not the whole city necessarily, but but he who he's been raised up to be the chief.
I think there's something intriguing here in the simplicity of Daniel. Like the simplicity of Daniel's action is offset against the complexity of the other Chaldeans, because like they make these repeated pleas of like negotiating with Nebuchadnezzar, and eventually there's a critical phrase in there that's just really it's interesting. He says like, I can tell now that you're buying time, right? But it's contrasted with a parallel line later on when Daniel sends an envoy to the king to say, ask of the king that I might be given time. And there's this sort of contrast that's observable in that between the simplicity of Daniel's and the integrity and straightforward character of Daniel's actions contrasted with the sort of clever scheming of those he's contrasted with. And so you have this like a bunch of do being made, trying to like drum up some sort of solution to this, and like this, and they eventually get to like what the king has always suspected, that like they don't know what they're talking about. But after this, all this like sort of like, yeah, if you'll just tell us a little bit, we'll tell you like, and like it's contrasted with when Daniel is going about it. It's just like, yeah, like let me have some time.
Yeah, it reminds me of this scene about which king was with the false prophets, where he says, she go into battle, and they're all, yes, go into battle, and he says, give me a real prophet. They're very skilled at telling the king what he wants to hear. But I think that's so. Daniel, he said, give me time, let me pray and see. You're not giving me dialogue, but it seems he is given time to do it, where the others just wanted. Yeah, that's a very good point.
But also too, there's a little bit of cultural background too heightens the importance of this chapter. Is that the Chaldeans are like, they're internationally renowned as like the people that understand best how to do this kind of like how to like possess and to apply this type of wisdom. And so if they've reached the end of their rope, the unspoken statement is like, there's no one that knows how to do this. No one on earth can do this if the Chaldeans can't do this. They are the height of the cult of the wise, and if they can't do it, then it can't be done, right? Which heightens the desperation and heightens the like solution that comes through and like offsets it and it emphasizes it because it can't be confused for a type of cleverness or sophistication.
As a just basic pattern, therefore, when you face such a crisis, take some time, pray about it, and see what God has for you. It sometimes seems, but it's remarkable how well that can work.
Yeah. It's also a sort of case study in like the stability that comes through a prayerful life. Compared to the frenetic, like the frenetic activities he's surrounding it. Like Daniel and his companions are like, there's a steadiness to that action that is offset to the like frantic sort of grasping of the other Chaldeans, right? They're trying to negotiate and play and like, and work around and try and like, there's a lot of like machination and scheming going on, but they're like there's a comparative peace and stability with them, like even though they're living under a decree of death essentially, like Like there's not an attempt to like go and join the like, you know, petitioning of the king. There's a retreat from that, in fact. And so there's like you can see the contrast there, that where everyone else is rushing to like supplicate before Nebuchadnezzar, they're retreating from that supplication to supplicate to the one who is actually above Nebuchadnezzar, right? But that's not the most obvious thing going on there. So you have this like radically anxious response happening here, and then you have this other response that is completely of another character to it.
Well, and one of the things that we'll see in the subsequent stories too, that when they characterize Daniel, he's going to, and his friends, they're going to do what they do, and if it results in them being killed, not like they want to die, but they won't do anything to save their lives.
Right.
He's going to act faithfully, and if God chooses in their acting faithfully to save their lives, then that's great. Whereas all these Chaldeans, that's all they want to do is save their lives. Their whole horizon is that way. And I think there is a contrast in the Christian life, rightly, that we should try to cultivate between the kind of things that define us. We're going to live a life of prayer and seek to be faithful. And if that leads us into something, we'll trust God for what that means and not get into this kind of, you know, well, if I do this and that, I can control things. Because there is, it doesn't mean you can't plan, and, you know, there's nuances here, but there's a contrast between faith and prayer and control and anxiety. When we feel when we try to grab control and manipulate things to achieve certain temporal ends, we become anxious. Well, why is that? Well, because we know we're driving and we're not that sure about our ability to drive or control it. The more we can operate in a mode of prayerfulness, leading to behavior that the God sort of leads us into and calls us to do, the more we can focus on the sort of discrete tasks at hand that God has given us, and trust God to organize the big picture we can't handle. And I do think the life of prayer, that is cultivating a pattern of prayer over time, cultivates that kind of trust. As you practice it, you learn to do what you're doing. When, contrast, if we allow ourselves to fall into that control anxiety motif, we multiply the anxiousness. So we always talk about the life of prayer, because it's what we habitually do, we become, and we cultivate in ourselves the states of being that correspond to our habits. And if we're always trying to control and manipulate circumstances to get the ends we want out of it, we become very anxious, controlling people. But if we cultivate lives that are founded on our prayer, and where what we do comes out of the discernment of our prayer, we cultivate a greater sense of peace. It doesn't mean we'll never feel anxious about anything. But it's we develop a pattern of bringing the anxiety of life there, and develop a pattern of experiencing a growing peace, something we grow over time. So I do think Daniel illustrates that pretty clearly.
There's another literary image here that I think that I just remember to note on is with the statue and the stone hitting the feet. The stone comes flying out of nowhere, hits the feet, and the whole thing falls, right? There's one commentator connects that to the David story, actually, except that there's an inversion where you have David flinging the stone at Goliath, right? The giant figure, and so you have like the parallelism. You have this like this awesomely huge figure that looms with terror, and like this like a flung stone brings the whole thing down. There's someone connected that to like echoing back to David.
Interesting.
David's defeat of Goliath and the Philistine army.
Yeah, and there's something else that and if you want to look into David and Goliath story, you must read Malcolm Gladwell, David and Goliath.
That's a great.
It's you can get a 20-minute TED talk. It'll change your whole appearance of David and Goliath. But after you do that, it still makes the point, because what Malcolm Gladwell points out is it wasn't as much of a mismatch as it appeared. There was greater power. One thing he points out about David, we always think of a shepherd boy with the slingshot stones. And Gladwell points out that there were certain kinds of artillery in the ancient world. There were archers, there were spears, and there were slings. And a good sling, a guy who carried a sling could hit something at about 100 yards. And hard. And we're already told early on that David killed, or at least David says he killed lions and bears, assuming not with his bare hands, So Gladwell points out that this giant, by his movements in the text, suggests that he probably has a kind of disease that causes him to be giant. So he probably didn't see very well. So he's this lumbering guy, and David's actually a warrior who's well able to do it. And so David's not just stupid; he knows what he can do. And part of the point of it then, that I do think transfers to the story and to the spiritual life, is David has way more power than appears, and and Goliath is not nearly so strong as he looks. And that applies here, that being in relationship with a covenant God who controls the world, these faithful men have tremendous power. And though this is the king of Babylon, known world, God was still sovereign over them. And when we face our enemies, sometimes we think, oh, well, this is so big, and I'm just praying here. So let's take a deep breath and think about it for a minute. That there's much greater power we possess than we think. As Ephesians says, able to do exceeding abundantly above all we ask or think, according to the power at work in us. We don't know what God's going to do, but the more faithful we are and the more we trust, it seems, the greater is the ability to see what God is doing through those who are faithful. But if we rewind the tape and we find Daniel and his friends in the beginning decide, hey, boy, why don't we just eat this food and not make a big deal out of it? Why don't we just, all of a sudden, you have no power. So sometimes the compromise that seems to help you get by actually weakens your power and makes you, less able to deal with it. So Daniel is a testimony of the spiritual power of faithfulness and prayer when placed in a situation, and we should never forget that.
And that is directly connected. That isn't a sort of concession to the political world. It's not like saying, well, I can't change things, so might as well pray about it. It's like, no, you only will change things by praying about it.
Yeah, and I think about our country, because, people can be broadly dismayed about things you see around. So what are you going to do about it? Should we form another political party and start, or what would happen if two things, if Christians decided to be more faithful in prayer and behavior and more prayerful? What might well up in terms of spiritual power that could have impact? We don't even know.
Otherwise, it's just Persia toppling Babylon, which is then toppled by Greece.
Right.
Yeah.
So those are things to bear in mind. Let's read about the end of this, and we'll wrap up with that. We've got to make good headway, 2 full chapters. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell down on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. A remarkable turn, as Hayden pointed out. The king answered Daniel and said, truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon. Real echoes of the Joseph story. And chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon, who ought to be very grateful, incidentally, at this point in time.
But who aren't, we find out.
Yeah.
Because then they go
Are
around
jealous,
trying to stab him in the back.
Yeah, because now he is, who are you to say?
But this sets up why that is such a lame thing to do later on, right?
Yeah.
Like when they try to get him thrown in the, when they eventually get back at him by getting thrown in the lion's den when the Persians take over, it's a real jerk move considering you saved all of you. Yeah. Yeah.
And Daniel petitioned the king to set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king's court.
Yeah.
So a remarkable transference in 2 chapters from 2 exiles, powerless, subject to all this oppression of being away from their country, the worship of their God, compelled to eat food they didn't want to eat, maintaining their faithfulness, and at the end of 2 chapters, being raised up to chief places in Babylon. It didn't directly echo at Daniel's little song in 2:20, but I did think of Magnificat, put down the mighty from their seat and exalted the humble and meek, which is a thematic, a part of the scriptures throughout. So we will read on from there. We'll pick up from there next week. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. Lord, bless us and keep us. The Lord, make his face to shine upon us, to be gracious unto us. The Lord, lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace this night and forevermore. Amen.